Well, November 3 is behind us, a very interesting election. And to evaluate that experience, Dr. Walter Vries has joined us on North Carolina People Tonight. He's the head of the Institute of Political Leadership based at the University of Wilmington. And he's also produced this little volume, Checked and Balanced. It's about ticket splitters and what they do in elections like we just had. We'll talk with him in just a few seconds.
North Carolina People is brought to you by Wachovia, banking, investments, and financial services for individuals, businesses, and corporations. Wachovia, we are here. Let's get started.
Walter, I'm a ticket splitter. What have I done in an election with my
Just
vote?
about what everybody else was doing. Splitting tickets all over the place.
Voting for one person in one party and rather another party?
In most elections now, people don't vote straight party votes like they used to. And in this particular election, in the county where I live, New Hanover County, they were splitting all over the place. And it was very difficult to find any patterns at all.
Now, when you did this study, this was an early on discovery. It's what, 2 years ago now? 3 years ago?
We did an original study in 1972, and that we found that ticket splitters there were saying, look, we want to vote for the person and not the party. We did this later study after the 1996 election, and we found out that there's a certain percentage of people who are deliberately voting for the president, say as a Democrat, and the Congress as Republicans, as a way of balancing the political party, the power between the two political parties. And this is something new.
I was going to say, is this now becoming the controlling block in an election, the decisive element?
Absolutely. In a typical presidential election like 1996, 80% of the people voted for the same candidate for president and for Congress, but 20% did not. And then of that group, there's a smaller group that made the decision, hey, we have to balance these parties off against each other. Now, and that's new in American politics. It's new that they told us about it. They have never told us about this before.
Well, the election yesterday, we're doing this program together on November 4. The election yesterday, ticket splitting in North Carolina, all over the place?
Everywhere. And a lot different than a lot of people. One of the things that sort of amused me was you couldn't find any pundit or anybody around in this state who would predict what was going to happen in that election. And with good reason, because I don't think anybody did. Anybody who tells you that they knew what was going to happen, I don't think they did. But the surprise was the Democrats taking over the control of the state house, and of course also the fact that Faircloth lost, because that was a very close race. But in many ways it paralleled what happened at the national level as well, where the Republicans were supposed to gain seats and really didn't make much difference. This election didn't make much difference at all in the way they controlled the Congress.
Last night in watching the pundits on CNN rather, they kept talking about the fact that the National Party had chosen this region of the South to play this business about the president and his problems, to see what would happen in an election like this. And they chose 2 congressional districts and the senatorial race, and all 3 of them lost. Now, is that proving something here, that kind of politics is on the way out?
Well, what I don't understand about that is that one of the key Republican polling officials met with one of my classes in the Institute 2 weeks ago, and they had done focus group studies, special studies of what would happen if you tied Monica Lewinsky and the president, 2 Democratic candidates. And he said it wouldn't work. Not only that, it'd be a backlash. But in spite of that, the National Republican Congressional Committee made a $10 million decision to target those kind of districts that you just mentioned. And it didn't work.
Why?
It didn't work because people aren't stupid. Politicians never seem to get over the notion that somehow they can't trick, they can somehow trick people into doing what they want. But voters are not fools. They see through these things, and they certainly saw through it on yesterday.
When you're teaching a class in your Institute of Political Leadership, which I want our viewers to know is a bipartisan, non-political process where young people who aspire to public service can learn how to do it, Do you analyze this kind of thing and take it apart and help them understand the forces that are working?
Sure. And one of the things that we do is over the long run, take a look at these kind of campaigns where they're called negative campaigns. I don't call them negative campaigns. I call them attack campaigns. Because a negative campaign could be one where you compare the record of yourself with your opponent, and I think that's legitimate. But in these campaigns, the effort is to destroy the persona of your opponent. Now that's an entirely different thing. And I think the American people and the North Carolina voters are getting tired of that. And I think you saw that reaction yesterday, not only here, but around the country.
I was going to say pretty uniformly that kind of thing, where it was done in dramatic volume, really backfired.
Sure.
And maybe it is saying then that this is something that's passed in our history and we'll move on.
I hope so, because I think these things go in patterns. And I think we're about at the end of this one, and I certainly hope so. Because a lot of people now say, well, the way you get started in politics and the way you start a campaign is to go out and attack your opponent. And I think that's wrong. I think you ought to be looking at the issues, and we try to teach that ethical component in what the Institute does.
How do you explain that New York race then, and what went on there? That must have been a violent kind of campaigning, but an entrenched, long-established senator, a very aggressive House member. Did money cause it, in a way?
I wish I had an answer for that. I don't. I wish I could explain that one easily, because it was by far, I think, the most expensive race in the country. And certainly some of the dirtiest advertising used. I mean, people are calling each other liars and that sort of thing. But I suspect, and I hope, and you just suggested this, that we may be starting at the end of that kind of process. People can take just so much of that. And what happened in this election, we were finding in the polls a couple of weeks ago, that a lot of older women were just getting turned off by the whole process. It wasn't so much a matter of Lewinsky and the president, although that was disturbing. It was just the attack on the process, and they just got tired of it. So they were going to withdraw from it. But apparently, a lot of them went to the polls on November 3rd that didn't expect to a couple of weeks ago.
How much of a role do you see the Christian Coalition playing now? I noticed that the race in the state of Washington, Ms. Smith was defeated. It happened in the Alabama gubernatorial race, and other places. Is this still a viable force?
Sure, it's a viable force, but it's like any other force, whether it's labor, Christian Coalition, whatever it might be. Their power, their strength rises and ebbs. And I think at this point, I think you probably had less special interest impact on this election than a lot of elections. Of course, several years ago, you know, AFL-CIO put all that money into the elections. This time, I think they tried to do it in terms of organization and that kind of thing. And I don't see, particularly when you look at Feingold, the impact of the special interest like we had in the past.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were doing this study of ticket splitting, in a situation like we just experienced here, the problem of money. I noticed some of the criticisms of Senator McConnell, who had all that money to dole out to candidates. He was against campaign reform, so he didn't give those fellows any of his assets. And he was charged with causing one loss last night. But are they locked in here? Campaign reform is still an issue that the ticket splitter is going to look for, isn't he?
Yes, but you're in a situation where the people who benefit from the present system aren't about to change it. I mean, it's just not going to work. And it's not going to work at the congressional level. It's not going to work at the state legislative level. I don't know how you change that. And you have to ask yourself, why should the incumbents change the system from which they get all the benefits? And unless there's some sort of enormous public outrage or outcry about this, but if you look at the list of issues in the election, that's one of the that's one that's on the bottom. So it's critical to the electoral process. I don't know how we get anything done about it.
Well, now I want to go back to the Institute just a minute, because I'm going to crow a little bit for you. Here you are out of this election. An alumnus of the program is now in the Supreme Court of North Carolina. The Secretary of State is a graduate of this. What are you really trying to do comprehensively here is raise up a generation of people who want to serve in public life, not starting out so party-leaning, but just genuine public service commitment?
Well, you recall, you helped me get this started 10 years or so ago, and when we at that time called a lot of people around the state, a lot of leaders, and said, what do you think of this idea, try to improve the quality of people in political and governmental office? Nobody turned us down. They said, that's a wonderful idea. And sometimes I feel like it's almost hopeless, particularly when you're in the middle of a campaign like the one we've just been in. You see all this negative attack advertising, and you wonder, are we gaining any ground? We are, because if you look at the graduates of our program, and there are now 467 of them, you can pretty well tell who they are by the kind of campaigns they run. I mean, they're issue-oriented. We teach them all the various techniques that are involved in attack advertising as a way to say to them, look, we don't want you to do that. I mean, there are some things that are more important than just winning, and doing issue-oriented campaigns and having a vision for what your community needs. That's the most important thing.
Well, now you get these young people exposed to people like David Broder, the famous columnist, Bob Squires, who was the consultant in these campaigns yesterday for the Democrats. Does that one-on-one kind of thing help both ways? I mean, they get a chance to see what the grassroots politicians thinking, don't they?
No doubt about it. What we do in the program is we bring in people who are in the business of doing campaigns, of making public policy. Matter of fact, my feeling is I really don't want people to meet with the fellows who are not in the business of making public policy. So we bring in people who do that, like the Attorney General in crime, people in education, and so on. Because they need to know, the fellows need to know in this program, that they're just people like us, and listen to what other people have to say to them.
One more question. How do I get in the program? Somebody might be listening to you and want to take part in this experience. How long is it? What does it cost? How do I get in it?
You apply to the Institute, and once you make an application, you're interviewed for 30 minutes by by some of the board members and some of the fellows that are graduates of the program. If you get accepted, and it's a very competitive program, there are no charges. Our feeling is that if we charge tuition and so on, we would preclude not large numbers of people from getting into the program. If you get accepted, if you get appointed as a fellow, then you go through 10 alternate weekends of training. And we teach you all the skills that there are involved in a modern campaign.
Quite an experience. How many graduates already?
467.
And that's really quite an impact. They're in a lot of these young people are in the legislature now too, aren't they?
There are 10 in the legislature. We have like 60 or 70 on school boards, county commissions, city commissions, mayors, judges. A lot of them in political party positions.
Well, let's go back to the Tuesday vote now. We've been sitting here talking, and the newspapers this morning were almost saying that the House in the North Carolina legislature is going to go Democratic. Mm-hmm. Why such a thing? Is that a derivative from what happened in the Congress, where the party pushed too far and shut down government? And here we had a session that ran for the longest in history. Somebody getting blamed for this? Is that what's happened? I
think it was a good analogy there. The Republicans shut down the Congress. We had gridlock. Twice they shut it down. And here in the state legislature, the House kept it going. And for what reasons, nobody seems to know, unless it was the per diem, right up until Election Day. And in the poll we did last Friday night, there were about 35% of the people in New Hanover County who recognized that and said, hey, that didn't make any sense. So I think there was an analogy between what happened at the national level and the state level, and I think there was a reaction to that.
Mm-hmm. What about women now in politics? This election has contrasted with, say, 4 years ago or 6 years ago, the year of the woman, you know, when Miss Boxer and all of them were. Now this year they were on the defensive in lots of these races. Has that attitude changed?
Yeah, but Bill, I think the women really decided the outcome of this election. If you look at the studies that were done as people left the polls, it seemed that the women were key in the Edwards race and some of the other races. And of course, there are more women voters than there are men voters. And it looked to me like they were one of the keys in both the Senate race as well as in the House races.
What about the Afro-American vote? That was written up a lot this morning.
It apparently was larger than a lot of people anticipated, and it was also very important, at least in the United States Senate race.
Given all that we saw and experienced now, do you feel comfortable about the political process as you're seeing it and teaching it now? Say the last 4 elections, has there been a dramatic change anywhere that we can detect?
I feel better today than I did yesterday, if that helps any.
Yeah.
I think there's a movement away, and I think this election was the case to really make that point, from all of the attack advertising and all the negative aspects of campaigning. It hasn't moved far enough, but I think it's going to change. And I think you might even see in the year 2000, some experts are predicting we're going to see some changes in the kinds of candidates that run for office in the year 2000 and beyond. And if I didn't feel that things are improving, I think I'd get out of this business, because it gets pretty depressing when you look at some of the advertising and some of the campaigns that are being conducted these days.
When they said to you the types of candidates, did they mean you're going to get people who have a more established record of responsible civic involvement to run for office, this kind of thing? Is that
Yeah,
hoping that will return?
Yeah, we need to open up the there are too many people who are running for the state legislature, for example, who are coming from very narrow occupations or groups, and there's not enough access to the process. And so we need to get more candidates from across the board. And I think people who have demonstrated leadership in other capacities, whether in business or in their churches or community organizations, we need to figure out a way to get them in. They are not participating. And I think that's a key thing for democracy in America.
Well, now, what impact then is the ticket splitter going to have on the next presidential election, given all that you've seen? 96, 98, is the stage being set here for this group to control this next go-around?
Yeah, they're going to decide the election, because what you have at the state level and at the national level is parity now between the two political parties, okay? So there are only maybe 5% of the people involved in an election who are basically going to make the decisions if you have that kind of competitive elections. And that's where the ticket splitters are important, because they're the ones that are deciding, as was said in the book, which party are they going to check and which party are they going to balance. I mean, they are the ones who are key to the elections.
And would you say they had that role yesterday when you look at North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, what you've seen in the Bush boys and their vote-getting ability? Is this kind of thing what we saw manifested yesterday?
Absolutely. That was not straight party voting. That was people, those were people splitting their tickets between the two political parties and making very conscious decisions about who the individuals were they're going to vote for. And I think that's what you're going to see in the future, that more and more the Americans are going to put the executive branch in the hands of one party and the Congress in the hands of another party. And you'll see that also at the state level with governors and state legislatures.
How do you see and what do you read into the 2 members of the Bush family now holding these gubernatorial, they're rather powerful positions, Florida and Texas, in terms of voting strength. What's this mean?
Well, if you ran one for president, one for vice president, you'd have it locked up.
Yeah.
No, I think they're both, particularly Governor Bush in Texas, in a powerful position to get the nomination in the year 2000. Matter of fact, he is saying he doesn't want to be out front as far as he is right now, but they certainly are going to be powerful in Republican politics. And as we discussed earlier, California, I think now is the 3rd state, primary state, in March. So where the decisions are made in that state, I mean, the presidential race, the nomination could be pretty much over.
Now, let's see. We had the gubernatorial races, 36 governors yesterday. Is that about, I don't know how many members of the Senate. But in the House, Democrats picked up a half dozen seats. What is this going to say to the leadership of Mr. Gingrich? What's going to happen to him in this?
I heard him trying to explain this morning, and what he said was, frankly, I can't explain it, which I thought was probably a remarkable explanation. But usually in that election, the non-presidential election, the party in power, the party that holds the presidency, loses some seats. But this, I think it's been since 1921, I think, that this has not occurred, where the Republicans should have picked up, as they said they were going to, maybe 20, 25 seats. They did not do that. So this again is an historic election in that sense. Same is true of the U.S. Senate. They usually, the party that's not in the presidency picks up 4 or 5 seats. They didn't do that this time.
We saw these elections then govern primarily about things that appeal to people as they look at it at home. They really were home-oriented issues, and domestic politics is what the former speaker said votes every election anyway. Are you concerned, though, about the growing sensitivity of issues like Iraq and the area over in the middle Europe? These things are going to get into political decision-making in the next few years, looking to 2000, these world situations?
I think only if the American people really see foreign affairs as a key part of their lives. I think they're more oriented now towards the state of the economy, towards education, what you're doing on crime, and so on. And foreign policy is not a big issue with a lot of American voters. That doesn't mean it couldn't be. If the Congress took the leadership on this, or the president, it could be, but it is not as of right now.
But our state, for example, it's 10th in the number of states in export trade around the world. It gets to be rather immediate here. If one of these shuts down and the furniture industry can't export, or tobacco, or whatever, it seems to me we've got to do a little better job of teaching about this anyway. Yeah, get the public to understand it a little better.
Yeah, I don't think they understand it because nobody's really made it an important issue.
Where do you see the role of television in the future? Cost of this animal? It really is a huge burden for political parties and individuals to carry. Has public television got a different role to play in the future, giving free time?
I don't know what else we can do. We can't very well limit the amount of money that's going to be spent on it, because I think that's unconstitutional. But there's got to be some way that particularly challengers have access to television, because without it, you're not going to get known. I mean, most of the American people get their information about politics and government from television. And in campaigns like this one, they get it basically from advertising. So if there's no access, they don't know who you are. And that's a problem that's got to be handled some way. And maybe access to public television, which is what they do in some European and other countries, is the way to go on it. But I think we have to try something.
Are you going now, knowing what you've learned from yesterday, will there be a sequel to this, or another effort at looking at checks and balances, since we've established the fact that this group is a really powerful and controlling force in the political decisions?
I think we're going to ride with it through the year 2000. But what we're going to do, because my co-author Lance Torrance is on the board of directors of the Gallup organization, is follow up the questions that we've been using since 1996, and then perhaps at some appropriate date do the sequel. But right now we think we're in pretty good shape, that we, maybe not that good a shape, but that we've predicted pretty well what we thought was going to happen yesterday and what will happen in the year 2000.
Do you worry about the fact that too much of what people understand or think they understand accept as fact is this soundbite world we live in today, and they don't get to read enough or hear debates of any length that really get to the issues? Does this experience recently concern you?
Yeah. Again, I don't know what to do about it, because what's happening on the typical television news story, it might be 30 seconds, maybe a minute. And what's happening is that local television, as well as national, is reducing the amount of time given to political and governmental news. And I don't know what you do about that. I thought that with this proliferation of all these channels on television, that we would get a lot more information about politics and government, and we're not. And again, I don't know the answer to that, but something's got to be done, because if you asked that typical voter, where do you get your information? 2/3 tell you I get it from television.
You come from out there in the great Midwest and over there across the border in the state of Minnesota, we've got an interesting governor taking control. What's
You're
going
going
to
to
happen?
ask me to explain how he got elected?
I want to know how a wrestler like that one could emerge.
Well,
That was quite a campaign.
Yeah, well, he certainly exhibits independence. Of course, he ran as an independent. I really don't know that much about him, but I find that intriguing that he won.
Here it is, ladies and gentlemen. Checked and balanced. A very interesting study of what happens in political elections and the theory that in the future, this group of independent voters is going to influence a lot of what happens in our country. Thank you, Walter, for joining me. Appreciate you being on North Carolina People this evening.
You're welcome.
North Carolina People